From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
These days, Congressman David Cicilline is a nearly constant presence on cable news, promoting the agenda of House Democrats and Speaker Nancy Pelosi. But is there a division within the Democratic caucus between Pelosi and the four freshman progressives known as the Squad? And fresh off a vote to impeach President Trump, does he have any appetite to work with the White House? Our guest this week on Newsmakers, Congressman David Cicilline. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Ted Nesi is on vacation this week. Congressman Cicilline, thanks for coming in. I know it's a busy week. Actually, it feels like it's been a busy 2 years, if we're being honest with each other on this. But let's start with this week. You voted to impeach President Trump at odds with Congressman Langevin on that vote. The proposal was shot down in the House. The vote was split among Democrats, but I want to know where your head is right now. You're voting to impeach President Trump. Can you still work with him?
Yeah, first of all, the vote is not to impeach the president. The vote was against the motion to table because then the resolution.
Essentially, Congress, we're talking about an impeachment.
Let me finish. Then the resolution would have been referred to the Judiciary Committee. My view has remained the same. The time has come to open an impeachment inquiry. That's the formal beginning of the process to consider whether or not articles of impeachment should be filed. That process takes a long time, but it would allow the Judiciary Committee to strengthen our hand in our effort to get witnesses and documents.
Fine. A big first step.
It's a big first step. So it's a formal opening of an inquiry. So I have not said the president should be impeached. I've said we should open an impeachment inquiry. There's ample evidence in the Mueller report to warrant the formal beginning of a process to consider whether or not the president committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and if we make a determination that he does, to file articles of impeachment. But there's a process to do that, and the Judiciary Committee is the committee to do that.
Okay, but please, I mean, this in many ways you're putting the cart before the horse, aren't you? You have before the committee, Robert Mueller coming before the committee. Why even bother if you're already starting to open the door in this first step for impeachment?
No, you have to have an inquiry before you can formally begin the impeachment process. When the impeachment inquiry was opened for Richard Nixon, it was 7 months before articles of impeachment were voted out by the Judiciary Committee. So you have to begin the process. Mr. Mueller would be part of that process, as well as a number of other witnesses. Documents would be produced, and we would make a determination based on the evidence we collected whether or not high crimes and misdemeanors were committed, and whether article of impeachment should be filed and what they would say. So this is at the process you would file. We've begun to conduct oversight with respect to the contents of the Mueller report. Mr. Mueller will testify on Thursday. But the formal process of opening an inquiry is the process by which the committee begins formal consideration of this. Look, the Mueller report evidences 10 specific instances of obstruction of justice by the President of the United States, directing his legal counsel to fire Mr. Mueller, to fire the special counsel, then telling him to lie about it and create a false document to memorialize that lie. He directed a third party outside the administration, Corey Lewandowski, to go tell the Attorney General, you tell the special counsel to limit his investigation to future presidential elections. Don't look at 2016. Another effort to obstruct the investigation. There are 8 other counts. This is serious misconduct evidence in the Mueller report.
So then back to the original question. Can you still work with the White House right now?
Yes. Look, we have successfully moved forward on about 230 pieces of legislation that have passed the House, 50 major pieces of legislation ranging from bills to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, to strengthen the Affordable Care Act, to provide equal pay for equal work, universal background checks, a veterans tax credit, number of very important bills that are sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. So we're getting the work done. My view is we have to do both things. We have to deliver on the commitments we made to the American people to drive down health care costs, to raise family incomes, to rebuild the infrastructure of America, to take on the corruption in Washington, and we have to hold the administration accountable for their misconduct. We have to do both things. I think we're showing that we are doing both things.
One of the people voting it down, Speaker Pelosi, and she has said we're not ready, or the country's not ready to move forward with those proceedings or get them going. She is focused on 2020. Don't you put your Democratic colleagues in conservative districts in a tough spot?
No, look, first of all, I don't think you make decisions about whether or not the president should be impeached, whether or not he's committed high crimes or misdemeanors, based on political considerations.
But there'll be political fallout.
There
even
may
if it's not a political
but there's
consideration.
Political fallout if you don't do the right thing. I think this is one of those moments where particularly all members of the caucus have a responsibility to make their own judgment about what they think is best for the country, what the evidence provides, what they think is the best course of action. I think it's important. You cannot have a president engage in persistent misconduct and then thwart the oversight of Congress as it relates to that conduct and not be held accountable. The American people elect us. We got the House back for two reasons. One, because we promised to deliver on our For the People agenda, driving down healthcare costs, raising family incomes by rebuilding the infrastructure of America, and taking on the corruption and self-dealing in Washington. We're delivering on those. The other reason we got the House back is because the American people wanted us to hold this president accountable. They expect us to do both things, and I feel very strongly you cannot. This is not just about President Trump. This is also about future presidents who are watching this lawless president not being held accountable.
Yeah, but the lawmakers in those conservative districts didn't vote along with you on that. So are you sure that that's how the Democrats got the House back?
Yes, I am. And I'll tell you this. There are a number of people who didn't vote for that resolution, in part because it referenced the president's racist comments when they are deplorable and disgraceful and one of the worst things I've seen him do in terms of stuff he said. Those are not actually impeachable offenses. So there are a lot of people who said, look, we need to refer this to the Judiciary Committee because that's the committee of jurisdiction. You're already reviewing a whole range of issues. But being a racist, sadly, is not an impeachable offense. So I don't think you can read too much into that. We're seeing a number of people from swing districts who have come out for the opening of an impeachment inquiry because I think they're hearing it from their constituents.
Let's talk about that topic, and I want to play a little bit of sound for you. Trump supporters have a new rallying cry. This was the scene at an event on Wednesday in North Carolina. Let's take a listen. Now, Send Her Back is obviously a reference to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. She's an American citizen, but was born in Somalia. Trump earlier this week sent out a tweet that you just referenced, referencing Omar and three other progressive congresswomen, Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, saying that they should go back to their countries of origin. The three I just rattled off, of course, were born in America. Does it surprise you how well the president's tactics resonate with a lot of people?
It's disappointing. I think that was one of the most disgusting, horrible things I've seen the president do. It evidences, most importantly, that the president doesn't understand what has made our country great and the envy of the world, and that is that people from all over the world come to America and try to build a better lives for themselves and their family, and that we have a set of shared values, our commitment to human dignity, to justice for all, to freedom, to opportunity. Many generations of immigrants, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Polish Americans, they all heard the same thing: go back where you came from. That is so un-American. It undermines the founding values of this country. It's not who we are. It was a disgraceful display of racism, and to see others chanting with him, I think, was really disappointing. Now, the president, I think, heard from even Republican colleagues in the Congress. Apparently, he heard from his daughter that this was just had gone too far, and so now he's trying to sort of backpedal and say, well, I didn't really mean it. I tried to speak quickly. We know that's not true. If you watch the tape, he waited 13 full seconds before he started again. He said exactly the same thing on Twitter, so it's his message. But look, this is a very dangerous time we're living in, where the kind of rule of law, the founding values of our country, where the understanding that our diversity is a great strength of America, are being challenged by this president. And we all have a responsibility to stand up and condemn this racism as loudly and powerfully as we can. Right
before the president sent out those tweets, Speaker Pelosi held a closed-door meeting with House Democrats in an attempt to, I guess, set the tone and, some say, rein in the squad, which is the four congresswomen I just rattled off. Of course, news leaks out of that meeting, including this nugget from the Daily Beast, that you challenge lawmakers to stick to the messaging and the policies of the Democrats. And I'll quote the Daily Beast. Pelosi, pointing back at him, meaning you, Congressman, said, "Everyone should heed your advice, including you." Sounds like a shot at you from the Speaker.
Yeah, no. I don't know if it was a shot at the Speaker, but the Speaker, I think, and I have disagreed on the opening of an impeachment inquiry. We've had a lively discussion about it. I have one view. I think the time has come to open an inquiry. I think the Speaker has been very clear that she does not think that that's appropriate to do at this point. I am a member of the leadership team and have always felt the strength I bring to it is not only that Rhode Island's at the leadership table, but that I have the opportunity to share my best thinking. And Speaker Pelosi has always encouraged us to do that. I responded to the Speaker by explaining every time I talk about the impeachment inquiry, I also talk about the importance of reinforcing the work we're getting done for the American people. We have to do both.
In other words, if you talk about impeachment, you'll get airtime and you're able to talk about other policies.
That's right. And frankly, the networks, the cable shows, they want to hear about oversight and investigations, impeachment. They're not particularly interested in covering the fact we raised the minimum wage, or that we provided equal pay for equal work, or reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, or passed 4 bills to lower the cost of prescription drugs. But we have a responsibility to communicate that, whether they are interested in asking about it, and we have to use occasions on television to do both things, explain what we're getting done for the American people, and also what we're doing to hold the administration accountable.
Just take us in the room, if you could. There's a narrative that there is a divide between the House Speaker and the squad right now, and that's why she called that meeting. Is that true? Do you feel that division within the House Democrats?
No, it's interesting. I know it gets reported as if there's some division in the Democratic caucus. It's interesting. We have the largest caucus we've ever had with the greatest diversity we've ever had. And, everyone brings their passions and their ideas and their priorities to that caucus, and some people prioritize this and have this view of that. And out of this, we build consensus as a Democratic caucus. That is exactly how the process is supposed to work. And a lot of it is out in the open, and there's disagreements about what's the best way to proceed on health care or on an infrastructure bill. But that's what the benefit of having a big, diverse caucus is. And the good news is we reach consensus, and we've been able to move forward as a caucus on 50 major pieces of legislation, over 230 in total, that will make a real difference in people's lives as the Senate Majority Leader will take them up.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller is scheduled to testify before 2 congressional committees next week, including House Judiciary. Mueller is notoriously tight-lipped, and he said he only wants to stick to the script, which is the 400-page Mueller report he handed over to AG William Barr. Do you truly expect to learn anything new next week?
Well, I think the American people will learn something new. The reality is most people have not read the Mueller report.
Is that really the purpose of this?
Absolutely.
Congressman Nadler has talked about that.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone should expect any new information. Mr. Mueller is not the sort of guy who's going to say, I kept this nugget for TV. Right. He's going to walk us through the report in a very judicious way. But, fewer than 3% of the American people have read the report. My guess is it's even lower than that. And it's a long report. I understand that. But I think when Robert Mueller walks the American people through what he found, the specific instances of misconduct, the pervasive systematic attack on our election by the Russians, the welcoming of that help by the Trump campaign and President Trump himself, and then the specific efforts by the president to obstruct or impede or end the investigation, I think it will be a very powerful hearing. It's not going to be explosive in terms of new evidence, but it will be the first time for most people that they will actually hear what this 22-month investigation.
Yeah, but it also allows the Republicans, of course, to bring up their narrative that the FBI, or at least the investigators that worked on this, are corrupt. And so doesn't that sort of almost backfire?
Well, it's going to give them an opportunity to do that. I think they're going to hear from Mr. Mueller a very strong pushback on that. What they're likely to do is put forth this whole, Peter Strzok thing, and how did this investigation start? Well, if they read the Mueller report, it's the complete report contains exactly how the investigation began when George Papadopoulos shared information with an Australian diplomat. So I think it will give an opportunity for Mr. Mueller to put to rest some of those specious attacks by the Republicans.
Congressman, we have to go to a break, but before we do, you and John F. Kennedy Jr. were friends at Brown University. If you could just take a moment and remind people how that came about and your thoughts on the 20th anniversary of his death.
Yeah, as we mark the 20th anniversary, we just think of the Kennedy family and the extraordinary contributions they've made to our country and the suffering that they have had in so many ways. He was my classmate at Brown.
How did you meet?
Took a political science class together, Professor Rosenblum, and we formed the College Democrats. It was John Kennedy, me, Bill Mondale was a year behind us, and Bob Walsh.
From the NEA.
Yeah, there was no College Democrats when we arrived at Brown.
That is kind of surprising at that time. What year would that be? All right, I'll let you off the hook. When we come back, we're going to continue to talk about things going on in Washington, D.C., but also the Providence Public Schools. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me this week, Congressman David Cicilline. Congressman, the first half we talked everything Washington, D.C., not everything, but a lot. I want to talk about Providence. To remind people, you were Mayor of Providence for 8 years, a devastating report recently on Providence Public Schools, saying they are among the worst in the nation. This has been going on for years. Do you feel like you owe the parents and students of Providence an apology?
Well, I think, look, we made substantial progress when I was mayor with a great superintendent, Melody Johnson, the creation of a very supportive citywide.
Boy, that's going to ring hollow to a lot of parents.
No, let me finish. Look, the Providence Public Schools back then were not where they should be. We had made incremental progress, but nowhere near. It's obviously been a decade since then. I think the condition has gotten worse based on that report. But look, this is our collective responsibility. We have to really support bold change, and obviously the mayor and the governor are talking directly about how to best do that with the new commissioner. But there is no greater responsibility that we have than the education of our children, not only preparing them for jobs in the 21st century, but to pursue higher education if that's their decision, and looking at the culture that is described in that report. We all, I think, have a duty not only to acknowledge it, but to commit to doing whatever we can. And certainly as a member of the federal delegation, we will stand ready and do stand ready to support the efforts, whatever the commissioner and the governor and mayor decide to do. But this has been a challenge in urban places like Providence for a very long time.
Definitely not unique to Providence.
But this report, I think, more than anything I've ever seen, is a call to action for all of us.
Mayor Lorza said he would be.
And by the way, I think all the adults in the system, from me on, owe the children an apology. We have a whole generation of kids who have lost opportunities because of the quality of the system, and that's something nobody should accept.
Mayor Lorza said he would be open to a receivership model, no small part because it enables them to do things like change the union contract. I'm just wondering how difficult was the collective bargaining agreement for you? Did you consider it a hindrance if you wanted to reform the schools?
Well, I mean, look, there's no question the collective bargaining agreement imposes some limitations on the system. There's no doubt about it. I think we were lucky. We had a union president at the time who was, I think, collaborative with the superintendent. We made some significant changes. But the reality is, there is no question that the success in a school is directly dependent on a great teacher and a great principal. And so you have to have a contract that allows you to support great teachers, to give professional development to emerging great teachers, and to get rid of teachers who aren't getting the job done. And so, you want contracts that provide that opportunity, but you need to support. I mean, you can't build a successful system, in my view, by beating up teachers and principals, because all the research shows that a really excellent teacher and a great principal make all the difference in the world. So we need to have a system that supports and encourages and identifies the great talent, and make certain that people who should be doing other jobs are encouraged to do that in a different profession.
Final question on this. As we tape this, it's a Friday morning. News out this morning that the state is going to move to take over Providence schools. Do you think that's a long time in coming, or are you surprised?
Based on the report that I read, I'm not surprised. And I think, if that's the decision of the commissioner and the governor and the mayor, then I know our delegation will do everything we can to support the work they're doing. But this has to be something, we can't rely on this great new commissioner to be the savior. This is a community, a collective responsibility. Everyone has to play a role, not just elected officials, but citizens of the state, because we all have a vested interest in the success of students in Providence.
Back to federal policy in 2018, healthcare, you actually referenced this in the first half of the show, unified Democrats as they fought to protect the Affordable Care Act. Now it kind of seems healthcare is dividing them, particularly when you look at the presidential campaign that's shaping up. And I'm wondering where you fall. Do you fall in the Joe Biden camp, giving people an option to choose government health care but still have a sort of a private element to it, or the Bernie Sanders total public health care, no private insurance?
Yeah. So let me just push back for a second about the dividing of Democrats. It is true that in the Democratic caucus and among some Democratic presidential candidates, there are a variety of different ideas that range from Medicare for all, to Medicare for all who want it, to buy into Medicare, to lower the age of Medicare, to a public option, and a whole range of others. And those are all about expanding coverage and driving down costs. On the Republican side, the President of the United States is in court with the Republican governors of this country in the Fifth Circuit trying to take away health care in its entirety, have the Affordable Care Act declared unconstitutional. Millions of people will lose coverage for pre-existing conditions. They will lose their coverage, their subsidies. I mean, it will decimate the healthcare system. So the difference between Republicans and Democrats is very, very serious. among the Democratic caucus is a bunch of good ideas. And so I think the system will end up with a private insurance option and some expanded use of Medicare. Maybe like
is that what you
Pete
want?
Buttigieg says. Yeah, Medicare for everyone who wants it kind of model. But I think the important thing is, there's a lot of play about the differences on the edges between some of these expansions. But the real difference is between what Democrats are fighting for and what the Republicans are doing. Voting to repeal it in its entirety, sabotaging the Affordable Care Act, and trying to take away coverage for pre-existing conditions that will hurt tens of millions of Americans. We shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah, but you still have the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warren over here, those ideas over here. Is that radioactive to the messaging that you are trying to get across, like you did in 2018 for Democrats?
I think the agenda that Democrats are really unified on is making certain that we drive down the cost of prescription drugs. That is one of the principal drivers of healthcare costs. We have a number of pieces of legislation we've already passed out of the House that will significantly reduce prescription drug prices. One of them is my bill, the CREATES Act, to make it easier to get generic drugs to market. So there's real consensus on driving down the cost of prescription drugs, and there's real consensus on fortifying the coverage for pre-existing conditions. And I think the Democrats will have a real debate about which of these proposals gets us there in terms of a public option, lowering the age of Medicare, and the like. But I think we have a lot of work to do. We're going to have hearings, and there's going to be a lot of debate, and I think we'll have the benefit of people, contributing their best thinking on this, and we'll arrive at a solution. And that'll be governed a lot by who our president is in 2020. That individual will obviously lead on which of these approaches we take.
Who are you watching?
I'm watching the vice president. I'm watching Pete Buttigieg.
Don't name everybody.
Kamala
Is there someone
Harris,
standing out to you right
and
now?
Elizabeth Warren. I would say those four have impressed me in the debates.
Okay.
And Julian Castro also, I think, has been really terrific.
You are the top Democrat on the House Judiciary's antitrust panel. You chaired a hearing, was that last week? It feels like a month ago, into Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Now, after the hearings, what do you think? Should those tech giants be broken up?
Well, don't forget, this is a hearing which is part of a larger investigation that we launched. The Judiciary Committee launched it, being led by the Antitrust Subcommittee. And this is a broad look at the digital marketplace and to see kind of what the absence of competition means, the sort of monopolies that exist, the discriminatory or anti-competitive behavior. So we're just in the very early stages of the investigation. And Congress doesn't have a role in breaking up companies, but what is clear is that these platforms, particularly platforms like Amazon and Facebook, they are essentially operating like monopolies with enormous market power. They're engaged in some discriminatory behavior, favoring their own products and services, prioritizing their placement on the platforms and deprioritizing.
Doesn't every store do that? You go to Stop and Shop.
The difference is it would be like if you go into CVS. It's not like CVS brand next to a name brand. It's like the CVS brand is here and the name brand is up 3 flights and there's no ladder. I mean, you can't actually find it. So it's different. And
I don't know if that analogy is quite true, but I get your point.
But the point is we want to make sure these
people like Amazon.
Right.
So,
but here's the thing. People like Amazon. I like Amazon. That's not the question.
Do you use
yes,
Amazon?
I am. But here's the question. What Amazon does is they mine the data. So they look at what's the hot item. It's a Greenwood table. And then they create a Greenwood table on their private label. And they put that on their website. They prioritize the Amazon buybacks for the Greenwood table. Guess what? The guy in Vermont making a Greenwood table, he's on the 3rd page. They put him out of business. So those sort of anti-competitive behaviors we need to know about. A, because it's reducing innovation, startups, entrepreneurship. It's creating an inability for people to create the next new Facebook, the next new Amazon, the next new Google. We want to make sure the market is working and there's competition so that new entrants into the market for the next new product, the next platform, will have a reasonable chance of success.
What would that look like then? I mean, how would you... we're talking regulation.
I'll give you an example. Facebook. Right now, if you're on Facebook and you are unhappy with the way they treat your data and the fact that they don't respect your privacy, and you think, I want to go to another platform. I want to take everything with me. You can't. And so one thing you could do is require portability and interoperability. So if you don't like the way Facebook treats your data, you can take everything, your social graph, and go to another platform that's fully interoperable with a bunch of other places you connect, and you then have a competition-based solution where another platform would come forward and say, we're going to give you better privacy protections, we're going to give you more transparency, and there would be competition. Right now, you're in the walled garden of Facebook. You can't really leave. And so that's one of the things the European Union has done that I think offers some guidance.
We have less than a minute left, so let's do this quickly. The president referenced Rhode Island in a tweet this morning, lashing out at New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. who said Rhode Island's economic turnaround is a credit to Governor Gina Raimondo. Trump said it's actually the national economy that the governor has to thank for that. What's your take? Isn't the president partly right, at least, that Rhode Island has benefited from the economy?
Of course, look, Rhode Island is part of the country. It benefits from the national, but we should be clear. The national economy is working very well for people at the top. It still is the case that working people are not seeing wages increase. It is still the case that the tax cut was provided to the richest people in this country, and working families are paying for it. So the economy is improving, but there are a number of people who are not feeling it. People are working 2 and 3 jobs just to get by, which is why Democrats are very focused on raising family incomes. We just raised the minimum wage yesterday. Not a single Republican, I don't think, voted for it. This is about kind of raising wages for working families. So,
Congressman David Cicilline, really good to have you back on the program. If you missed any of it, it's online, WPRI.com. Don't forget our podcast through iTunes. I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.